By the way, I don't like sucker punches. So for every one of our presenters who's then listened to a response and then getting ready for your Q&A, for every one of them, I've spoken and said, look, I think I want to draw out this to make sure that they had 30 seconds to think about it beforehand. So help me out here. I need some live and honest reports from you. I've done a quick survey, trying to be as discreet as I could, of who understood the circle diagrams. So I just need real quick, if you understood what those circles mean, raise your hand. Okay, we're 50-50. Can we pull the slide up? I think we're ready.
Okay.
There you go.
Well, what we're doing is scripting a list of questions. When it comes to the church we're involved in starting as IMB missionaries, or for that matter, working through an Epaphras to examine a church that we may not have known personally, we're asking questions about these functions, about this identity, and even about formal leadership. Across the top, you see the number of attenders. The numbers are not important. As an example, number of attenders, those who've accepted Christ, and those who have been baptized or entered into covenant with the church on the across the top. The circle being solid, you might have noticed that some circles were dotted lines, where that question about church identity, this is a church that is presumably considers themselves church, not a small group, not fellowship, that they have identified as church. And then you can imagine among the icons, obviously the leader, the Lord's Supper, the teaching of the Word, the giving, the going. Again, have they gone and started a next generation? On down the list, there's fellowship, there's worship and prayer. These characteristics consistent with even our 12 characteristics of a healthy church with the IMB. Now, the one of the 12 characteristics that is missing there, you'll notice, matter of church discipline. There was a time when we considered going into Acts 4, but the actual icon was rather morbid with little X's on its eyes and things. So we haven't, truthfully, we haven't figured out exactly how to track that in a yes or no question or in an observable setting in the actual gathered congregation. Those are meant to be observed items. Now, whatever would be missing there as we ask questions of a Colossae, as we get news from a Corinth, to understand whatever's missing, whatever's anemic, it deserves attention, that we might speak back into those congregations. The term I used was epistle them a little bit to examine. It's a fascinating study if you ever want and find this tool, to pick this very tool up and ask the same 12 characteristic questions as you read the book of Corinthians. And when it comes to the Corinthian church, to see Paul examining and speaking into almost every one of these functions, including church discipline, by the way. And to realize again that in absentia, this task was still yet ongoing in the Apostle Paul's ministry. And I'll leave it to you to, in your knowledge of 1 Corinthians, exactly how healthy the Corinthian church was. Whatever you find there, it wasn't sufficient. The book of 1 Corinthians is needed in that context. Is that okay?
All right, thank you. I think it's very helpful. I'm familiar with the tool, used it, literally decades ago, learned it from you or someone who passed it on from you. All right, questions?
It's clear in Acts, seeing that there is a real church before there are elders.
Okay.
That there's going to appoint elders, or that elders didn't exist, but there was a true church.
Okay.
When you look at the nature of the church and recognize that there are some things that a church should be doing when working from the ground up, how do you do that without clearly recognized, qualified leaders?
That's great. I think I'm answering your question by a helpful distinction in the notion of being and well-being. That where we have a group of baptized believers covenanted together to obey the lordship of Jesus Christ, I just came back on stateside assignment, and as a member of, dare I say it out loud, he's actually an alum. First Baptist, Inola, Oklahoma, is healthier these days than it was on my last stateside. where our pastor was actually a Southern graduate. In which case, churches do at times, in the well-being aspects of church, flow in and out of that functionality, that right appropriation of ordinance, because it's not just an observable function, it's also the motives in the giving, the motives in the self-examination in the Lord's Supper. So we've got to go beyond a yes-no survey to an intimate knowledge. The idea that everywhere we've introduced not just the being, but the well-being as the expectation of the groom, that expectation has allowed us to speak in and begin to call for. And if I can say, do our best to not rob indigeneity while demanding the expectations of the groom. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
In that case, I'll take one more sentence. I watched people pray. I read Matthew 6. I learned prayer by praying. When you pray, pray this way. I learned by praying. I watched Lord's Supper. I studied Lord's Supper. I believe every time I take it, I learn about Lord's Supper. In confession and examination and unity and expectation of the second coming and reviewing of the gospel, one of the greatest tools for discipleship we have, Lord's Supper. In the midst of, yes, intellectual assent, but obedience and knowledge are great friends. As we put it into practice, we continually learn, and they catalyze each other, don't they? So hopefully that function is ongoing and it's growing. It'd be maturing over time. Not every aspect of well-being is a matter of being, but if you're going to be, the matters of well-being are expected by the groom.
Looking for your hands. Okay, we've got a couple over here.
I was interested in a couple of the questions Dr. Barnes asked, but even specifically mentioned in Foundations twice about just the risk of creating dependency as a missionary or pastor being there, but also funds. So I didn't know if you wanted to comment on the funds portion of it.
Yeah.
Is there...
When it comes to that risk, what I'm doing is giving an apology for going downstream and examining. I hope that that's understood. That what you're asking about specifically the finance. When we're seeing movement strengthening strategists, as they describe them, being mobile, moving around up and down generations in a church planting network or stream, there are times when we have provided training budget. Wherever our personnel are at times, we do provide training budget. Many of these networks across North India have begun at times with a 50-50, even now taking up offerings and sending movement strengthening strategies far beyond our funding. It would not be right for me to say that we haven't invested. And again, I realize even in some cases, as I guard and seek to campaign indigeneity, I want you to hear a confession in this. When it comes to that circling back of pastor-teacher development, as we introduce that with a church planting network or stream, they typically don't have a vision for it. And where they don't have a vision for it, the truth is they don't typically raise funds for it. So here we are in the midst of the rock and the hard spot. We definitely want to cast vision for that to take place. For us to cast vision, we actually are going to implement the training for them to see the value and see the depth over time. And the reality then, we would be transitioning back toward an indigenous source of funding because the pastors haven't typically seen the need to fund and fund their own education in that context. That said, you do realize we're tracing along behind church planting training, the reproduction of churches with a training that we feel is essential. That funding that we're talking about is not landing on the edge or on the seed sowing or the disciple maker, or even the church formation or church planter, as in terms of salary, in terms of subsidy. We're funding training in that regard. And as far as we can, and even tracking with these different networks taking over that funding over time. Good question.
One more?
In that dogmatic process, the confessing the faith, what's the role, in your opinion, of traditional articulations of the Christian faith, like the In particular,
Yeah.
the ecumenical
Good.
creeds.
Good. Ecumenical creeds, we haven't had much need to go far beyond the year 2000 to actually put up an example that they might contrast and compare. We're doing our best to avoid, even as we wrestle, by that I meant the BF&M, okay, 2000. As far as we can, there's even times when we've gone and done some of the teaching on different church councils based on various heresies, to ask them what was the issue in this context, how did they resolve it, what was the purpose, what type of statement came out of that, to demonstrate the process. At times we might link it up with one of their own confessions related to soteriology or otherwise, but I haven't seen a lot of need to go beyond the BF&M. Now, even in that, we're questioning about how does what you've put forward fit with orthodoxy. In a sense, over time, we're also getting to a North Indian orthodoxy as we start to compare the different statements across 12 different church planning networks. And they realized we hadn't considered that question. We hadn't considered that verse. We would need to go back and add. Can I tell my very quickly anecdotal favorite story in that regard is that it happens that Hindu background folks tend to be trichotomists. I don't know if you know that. I was listening to them argue back and forth one time. It is literally, David talks about my soul will go to Sheol, knowing my spirit will go to Sheol across the Psalms. They were looking in the Gospels and seeing Jesus give up his spirit, know his soul. And I'm like, guys, dichotomy, trichotomy, take a pass, keep moving. A brother named Randy said, Nathan, be quiet and listen for a second. They're trying to discern the difference of what's in them from the cow and the dog and that's not eternal. What is it that makes that dog? What is it that makes that cow alive? That's not eternal. That doesn't face judgment. And if we just be patient for a minute, though I may not prefer trichotomy, they're trying to put away reincarnation with the Word of God, wrestling at that point. And a couple years before, they would struggle to read. I'm gonna let that play out and wrestle and love it along the way. And I can live with a tertiary trichotomy issue related to trichotomy, I suppose. Anybody else on that? I've used more time than...
Do you need to ask that?
Okay. God bless.
Thank you very much.